is the time when China said, enough is enough.
For China, I think it is a kind of brand new practices.
The greatest risk to these companies is that they will lose the ability to have a competitive access to the Chinese marketplace.
This is going to probably shape the future trajectory, that on the one hand, there's some normalization on the trading relationships, but on the other hand, the kind of tech competition is going to escalate.
The longer-term issues, I think, will be determined less by the toing and froing of the tariff and related negotiations, but with ultimately what the shape of the world looks like in 5 and 10 years' time.
I feel that the atmosphere between these two countries are becoming normalized.
The Chat Lounge. Chat Lounge.
Chat Lounge.
The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Welcome to the Chat Lounge. I'm Tu Yun. Beijing has launched 2 surprise probes targeting U.S. semiconductors, one on dumping, the other on discrimination. Joining me for a chat on this topic, Liang, a professor of economics, Willamette University in the United States, Dr. Zhou, the deputy director of the Institute of American and Oceania Study, Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation, and Warwick Powell, an adjunct professor, Queensland University of Technology, Australia. Great to have you all back on the show. So let me begin with Dr. Zhou here in Beijing. First, on the anti-dumping probe, many people were surprised that China's anti-dumping investigation is aimed at analog chips, not CPUs or GPUs that usually grab headlines. So why focus on analog chips?
Well, actually, if you know the nature of the anti-dumping, we know that it's a kind of rights, given by the WTO as all the members. They are having, the commitments of not interfering with the international markets by subsidies or kind of interference of the prices. So if one economy is trying to do something to support the enterprises or the companies when they are doing the business for the international competition by lowering its prices, the other economies or other members of WTO have the rights to trying to investigate that. So anti-dumping, actually, there are several kind of conditions. The first one is that these products have, some of the selling policies, which is apparently lower than what is sold in the domestic market. Well, the second is that, this country, the host country, when they import those products, the related or similar industries, they are affected or they are harmed. And the third condition is these two things have some connections or consequences. So for all the members, they do have the right to initiate or launch the anti-dumping practices. But if you're talking about the semiconductor, it's a really very new area in my understanding, because most of these, already existing anti-dumping affairs are something to do with the textiles, with the steel or the shoes or other areas like the solar panels or some other things. It's very rare for the semiconductor because that it is leading products or leading sectors. It means that these products have a much higher profits. As you mentioned about the GPU or CPU, those kind of things are very expensive. So not too many manufacturers or countries can do that, can make some of these things. So they don't have to lower their prices for better competition and gain a larger share of the market. But if you are talking about these specific products that we are trying to do some investigation, these products is really widely used compared with GPU and the CPU. So there are more competition in this area. I think that, China's Jiangsu Association of the Semiconductor, they raised this proposal. They said that the import of those products are distorting or affecting the competition and order and make the market distorted. So I think that is kind of argument. So we are trying to have this kind of argument and trying to do some investigation. It doesn't have to mean that these behaviors are there, but we need some response to those companies' requirements.
So what kind of harm has it done to, those Chinese manufacturers? You said if it an anti-dumping investigation is launched, there must be some harm done to those who launched this case, right?
Yeah.
What
So
kind of?
actually, the dumping actions is kind of trying to get a larger market share and expel or driving the existing companies away, or the other competitors. They want to stay in this market, so they have to lower their prices too. In this regard, they may have a lot of harmed by lowering the prices because they cannot have enough profits. So when the anti-dumping, affairs are happened, I mean, the domestic markets, domestic companies, they suffered a lot by these kind of behaviors. As we know that for the economy, this is just the first step. Normally, when the company is trying to dominate the market, they will use their policies as lowering prices at the first stage. When they have destroyed or trying to be the only supplier or just one of the very few suppliers in that sector, they can rise the prices later. So this is the harmness when the dumping things is happening, and it's unfair actually. Legally, it is something to do to violate its commitment in the WTO, the multilateral trading system.
Right, like Dr. Zhou just mentioned, compared with digital chips like GPUs or CPUs, analog chips are often seen as less advanced. People might even compare them to analog TVs versus digital ones. You would think that that would make them lower end, less profitable, and easier for Chinese manufacturers to dominate. So, Professor Powell, why are U.S. companies found dumping them in China when you would think Chinese firms would have the edge in this market? Is that plausible?
Look, it is plausible because there are legacy manufacturing capabilities that have been established for a long time in these areas, and these sorts of enterprises are working on business models that seek high volumes at relatively low margins. And so if volume throughput is being affected, then it is important for operational purposes to find markets to discharge products to so as you can maintain high utilization rates of your equipment. And I suspect that that's what's going on. I think the thing to remember about the analog chips, though, is whilst they don't get the headlines, as you say, they're actually fundamental to what we'd call the digital world. We find them in EVs, in automotive sector. We find them in industrial machinery, electricity management systems, and of course in the yet to fully blossom Internet of Things sector. So analog chips is really the mechanism that connects the digital world to the physical world. It enables the collection of data, whether it's light or movement or sound or smell and those sorts of things. And it also enables the control of energy resources within application environments. In fact, GPUs are actually pretty inert unless that infrastructure in the AI world is connected to the real world through some means or another, and analog chips are the means by which we do that. From a revenue point of view, globally, the analog chips market's worth about $100 billion US, which is somewhere between 12 and 16% of total chips revenue. So it's certainly not, from a revenue point of view, the biggest part of the sector, but it's also not a small part. And for many of the firms that have been making these chips, and particularly the ones that are subject to the investigation, this has been part of their core business for a long time. So for 3 out of the 4 firms, the China market represents upwards of 30% of their revenues in this particular product category. So it's not a small distance as far as they're concerned.
Right. Then, Professor Liang, help us understand the timing of those probes. They actually came before U.S.-China trade talks in Madrid. So people are asking, is it more about negotiating leverage than semiconductors?
Oh, I think part of it, yes. I think the timing of this anti-dumping probe and also the anti-discrimination probe happened before this Madrid talk. But I think at a more fundamental level, I do think that this is time for China to really safeguard its own interest, right? To safeguard its technological sort of the advancement space. And I think there is evidence, for example, the Jiangsu's Semiconductor Industry Association has shown that these analog chips, which, yes, they are legacy chips, typically, 40 nanometers or higher, they've shown the price have continuously and significantly declined, in quote, throughout 2024. And they're also showing the imports of these analog chips had gone up quite substantially. It grew by 12% in 2023 and 22% in 2024. So in other words, there seemed to be some evidence suggesting this kinds of dumping behavior. And I think that is definitely a problem because these chips actually account for about 40% of the total chips market in China. So it wasn't trivial, as Professor Powell talked about. And I think also, as you just mentioned, that there are many Chinese firms like Hua Hong Semiconductors, SMIC, or Shanghai Fudan Microelectronics, and others. They are actually operating in various segments in this chip business. So I think these kinds of dumping behavior is really, in a way, suppressed the market prices and in a way hindered the Chinese firms from being able to really scale up their production and seize a larger market share. So I think from a more fundamental level, aside from gaining some sort of bargaining chips at the negotiation table, I do think this has remained a problem that China needs to address sooner or later. Not to mention the anti-discrimination probe, which I think we'll get to. I'm actually surprised that, this has been going on for such a long time. I would say, as the Ministry of Commerce stated in their official record, some of these discriminatory policies or behavior from the United States, it has started as early as 2018. So I think it is time for China to safeguard its interest and started these kinds of investigations, even though we know the WTO is in limbo. But I think still this shows that, China is going to and able to use these kinds of legal tools to safeguard its interest. And I think also really legitimize, right, these sort of competition in the tech space and allow China to also, use these legitimate tools to safeguard its interest.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Like you just mentioned, actually, those discrimination or discriminatory measures by the U.S. side have been there for quite some time. And the Chinese Commerce Ministry says the probe is based on the additional tariffs on Chinese integrated circuit products based on the Section 301 investigation since 2008 and actions taken since 2022 to restrict exports of IC products and manufacturing equipment to China and to limit the participation of U.S. personnel in Chinese semiconductor projects. Then, Professor Liang, why do you think China waited until now to launch this probe? Was it saved for, maximum impact or anything else?
Well, I think, again, China has the goodwill to try to cooperate with the United States, through negotiations to resolve some of these differences and this sort of relatively, I would say, the confrontational stance, right? But I think the United States has not really heeded attention to China's resistance, right? And China's criticisms against these kinds of behaviors. And what they have done is really doubling down on these behavior. I think the last assault really comes from, Donald Trump back in 2025 in May. It basically, changed Biden's policy on Biden's diffusion AI policies. Essentially, it really doubled down on restricting, China's access to these GPUs and other advanced chips, and also really take measures, like you mentioned earlier, to allow AI companies to use the NVIDIA chips to develop China's AI models, and also not allow China's developers to use the NVIDIA chips. So I think this just shows that without these kinds of legal tools, right, and the more rigorous practices to safeguard China's interests, just through goodwill, through negotiations, through talks, right, would not be as effective. So I think really this is the time when China says, with all these aggressions, right, coming from the United States, it is time for China to take a different measure. And I think same thing was similar, with the rare earths restrictions. I think again, China actually has a lot of tools, right, in its toolkit. But I do think that China will use those tools when it sees appropriate. And so, the timing, yes, is important for the Madrid talk. And I think, in the past 4 months, there have been 4 talks going from Geneva to London to Stockholm and to Madrid. And I think that, every single time you can see the United States seem to step back and, do something else that pretty much, I would say, in a way, walk away from the earlier consensus. So I think, this is the time when China said, enough is enough. And so we do need to use other means, right, these legal ways to both boost China's bargaining power, but also really use different, maybe more effective ways to safeguard China's interests and push back the U.S.'s aggressions.
All right. And from a third country's perspective, Professor Powell, do you have any other interpretation of this timing?
Look, as Professor Liang said, I think it really does dovetail into the Madrid talks, but there is an overriding set of issues here that go all the way back to 2018. So this isn't a new thing. I think China has consistently demonstrated not just goodwill and sincerity in its willingness to engage in bilateral discussions with the United States, but an incredible amount of patience. The United States has, over the course of the last 8 years to 9 years, progressively ratcheted up the heat with the aim of containing China's access to new technologies, thereby restricting China's own economic development. And during that period, China has engaged in a number of rounds of discussions with the United States, whether it was during the Trump administration times or in the early days of the Biden administration, all of which I think is aimed at trying to find a satisfactory consensus solution to the issues on the table. And every time there seems to be one step forward in these discussions over time, the United States then turns around and adds new measures. It ratchets up the rhetoric and really puts a spanner in the works of trying to find a settlement that works for all parties. So it is sensible and understandable and arguably a little bit belated that the Chinese side has eventually reached into this first step of its legal toolkit to examine the situation and lay the groundwork for legally based responses to American containment and restrictions.
You both agree that the actions seem to be a little bit belated, but Dr. Zhou, with these actions, belated actions, similarly, at the core, what does China hope to achieve by launching these investigations? Though I think other guests have already touched upon this, but from the Chinese side, what's the purpose?
Well, I would say that naturally it may be our consideration about whether China will do some kind of investigation to do with this discriminative way of treating Chinese companies. I think that is a kind of a very normal phenomena in the world when the United States is trying to force other countries to obey or trying to bow down to them, and they will just follow. So it's really a rare thing for other countries to say no to U.S. actions or practices. As for China, I think it is a kind of it's a bit brand new practices for this kind of anti-discriminative investigation. So when China published these regulations at the first time, a lot of foreign companies just worried that maybe China will abuse the use of this kind of new tools to interfere with companies' benefits. But some of them argue that it's not clear about what China will do with this new tool. So continuously, we are saying that China is very cautious about using these new tools because we know that when you are opening a Pandora box, maybe a lot of unexpected things will happen. So we are very cautious in doing that. But the first case is not United States. That is Canada. When Canada trying to put more unilaterally tariffs on China's EV, new energy vehicles, China used these kind of practices to try to investigate what Canada's government was doing. And we have more related taxes or tariffs to put for the import from Canada. So as a response, I would say that is a very, very unique one for China to use these kind of new tools because we abide by our commitments in the WTO. We are not just trying to do a lot of interference of the practices to do with businesses. So this is the second time. I think that is a real our kind of requirement from the market. A lot of companies suffer from this unilaterally or discriminative behavior from United States. So we have to be a little bit more clear about the impacts, how much that the companies of China affected by these discriminative practices. So this is the reason why we want to put it here. It's not just in my understanding, personal perspective. It's not just for the United States, because when we are trying to do that, I noticed that there are a lot of new pressures from U.S. government to the other trading partners. U.S. is similarly to pressure other economies and other countries to discriminate the trade with China. I think that is a very dangerous thing, because most of these economies in the world are the members of WTO. We have the most favored nation agreement or principles. We should treat every economy equally. If one country or one economy is trying to discriminate the other WTO members, that will distort the basis for the multilateral system. So I think it's really our message that we want to deliver to the world. We have to obey our promises. If we are trying to change that, everything need to be based on the negotiation with the related stakeholders instead of just trying to do something unilaterally. So I would say it's not just a kind of attitude or tool to threat the United States or have more cars. It may be beyond that. I mean, that is my understanding with this kind of probe.
All right, and we'll dive deeper into whether those targets or those goals of the Chinese side may be achieved or how effective those probes can be. But let's talk a little bit about the implications or impact of such investigations. So how might the anti-dumping probe affect those U.S. chip makers, especially? I think Professor Powell mentioned that they've got a big exposure to the Chinese market, especially Texas Instruments and analog devices. So then, Professor Powell, what kind of impact do you think they'll have? Who's likely to face the most severe consequences?
Look, a lot depends on ultimately what the investigations find, number one, and what the response is from a policy point of view. Number two, the policy response could, from the point of view of the American firms, in a worst case scenario, lead to the loss of competitive access to the Chinese market. And ultimately, that has severe implications for the bottom line of the American firms. Once Chinese buyers of analog chips qualify and switch to alternative supply options, those supply options tend to become quite sticky. You don't want to be chopping and changing out of these sort of foundational technologies on a regular basis, given that their reliable operations is central to your own value proposition to the marketplace. So the greatest risk to these companies is that they will lose the ability to have a competitive access to the Chinese marketplace. In the short term, it is conceivable that they will need to suck up any impacts with squeezes on their own margins. That's not something that enterprises can do forever, but in the short term, it's certainly a response that they could have in the face of possible punitive or actions from Chinese authorities should they find that the dumping has occurred. Yeah, so look, from a worst case point of view, we're looking at a medium-term structural loss of access to what is actually one of the world's largest markets. As Professor Liang mentioned, it's in China's terms, it's analog chips make up a very large proportion of the chips market, and you've just got to look at what the application drivers are. With these kinds of chips, they're being driven by the Internet of Things economy. They're being driven by the growth of electric vehicles, by 5G technologies, automation. This is why the analog space is actually incredibly important for the transformation of industries and through the digitalization processes of missing out on what is, in many regards, I think, a relatively stable growth market would be. If I was a CEO or a shareholder in any of these companies, I would be concerned.
This has been the Chat Lounge. When we come back, find out how the investigations might reshape China's chip market, the trajectory of the chip conflict, or even the broader tech rivalry between the two countries. Don't go away.
The strong wind was howling and whistling. He was the first Chinese citizen to graduate from Yale University in the mid-19th century.
I was born on the 17th of November. She had prominent features. 3 of us were old enough to lend a helping hand.
He navigated between 2 vastly different cultures and moved further to realize his dream and promote understanding between the people of China and the United States.
Ye Mingxing was a native of Hanyang. I realized no danger. China is really awakening.
Come and join us in discovering the incredible journey of Yong Wang in his autobiography, My Life in China and America. Check out the Audible stories on radio.cgtn.com and all major podcast platforms. Just search for the podcast Books and Beyond and find My Life in China and America.
Welcome back to the Chat Lounge. We continue our chat on China's probes into U.S. semiconductors. And Professor Liang, which company would you be most concerned for?
Oh, I mean, I agree. I think these American companies, right, they are really much reliant on the Chinese market. Even companies like NVIDIA, right, that's prior to the ban of selling H20, they pretty much rely on the Chinese market for about 30% of their revenues. So I think, this is sort of a wake-up call to these American chip industry that if, they lose access to the Chinese market, not only they lose all these revenues, but I think they're also losing the opportunity to compete, right? To be able to know, the industry trend, to know the consumer demand, to really able to compete with, the best manufacturers in the world. So I think that kind of market dynamics, right, and the loss of demand, I think it's really going to be disadvantage for these chip companies. And I think going back to your earlier question in terms of, how this would make or not only affect the US companies, but also China's companies. I think one thing about timing is also, I think China also feels this is the time because it was able to really very quickly ramp up its production capacity of these legacy chips, right, 20 nanometers or above, considering that back in 2015, China only manufactured about 17% of the global share of these legacy chips. By 2023, it reaches 31%. And the forecast is going to reach about 39% by 2027. So these are based on some of the Rhodium and other CSIS research that their findings. So in other words, I think this is time when China also feels confident that if it cuts the market access of these Western firms, it is able to ramp up production and produce these chips domestically for the market needs. So I think in that sense, I do see that China is able to seize a bigger market share if these kinds of anti-dumping investigations does find, substantive evidence that the U.S. firms are manipulating in the price and dumping their products on China's market. And I think in some ways it's unfortunate, right? I think, China is willing to work with these Western firms and have the kinds of technological cooperation that eventually will benefit, both sides, right? Either China increases the market share in exchange for some technological transfer or spillovers, or other firms, they are going to be able to get the Chinese market and collaborate with China so they are able to get the revenues to fit in their bottom line and help to provide more funds for their R&D, and also, again, participate in the very competitive ecosystem and innovative system in China. So I think, unfortunately, this could create a lose-lose, scenario, even though I do think that, if Chinese companies are able to grab a market share, that seems to be favor the Chinese firms, at least in this legacy chip sector. But I think overall, cooperation, it's really going to be helpful for technological advancements, right? That economists always talk about this endogenous growth, where, corporations and collaborations and technological innovations from very foundational science, where you can see a lot of Chinese scientists and American scientists, they cooperate in the AI space. And also from a market share perspective, I think if you are able to divide the labor and scale up the production, it's going to be much better, right, than having this kind of more confrontational approach when it comes to trade or technological innovations.
Yeah, like you said, it could benefit local Chinese chip manufacturers because they finally can get a break from the fierce competition from their U.S. counterparts. But it's always a double-edged sword, right? It benefits chip manufacturers, but on the other hand, Chinese manufacturers using those chips could face some difficult situation there. There's one supply chain director warning that switching to domestic controller area network chips takes some 12 to 18 months of recertification, and sudden U.S. supply cuts could halt production. So, Dr. Zhou, how significant a risk is that?
Well, it is true that globalization has made us have a very, very good life. So we can depend on the intercollaboration between the different countries, and especially for the semiconductor industry. I think it's one of the most globalized sectors. We have so many different advantages in different countries. They can only collaborate to make the perfect products. So based on that kind of scenarios, if China have to do these things by ourselves, I think that the efficiency would be really a big problem, and also the sustainability of the supply will be another problem. And it is also true for the United States. I think that rebalance of the semiconductors are meeting a lot of big issues, as these two professors have just mentioned. Anti-dumping or some kind of investigation will give maybe another additional tariff for them to export to China, while on the other hand, the U.S. is putting more tariffs under the 301 investigation on the import of the semiconductor from other countries, including China. So these companies have to find out enough or big enough market to support their products and the research and development. And these naturally are bad thing for the welfare for all the related stakeholders. So for China, I think that it's extremely important issue, because we are much bigger manufacturer, and I think it's a much bigger demand for the semiconductors, including the analog chips. So we have to try to do more things. But when we have to do that, we do not have any other choices. I mean, many companies really notice that as opportunities. So in the previous several years, I attended many conferences, and some of these are to do with semiconductors. For the Chinese companies, they are really happy that the United States do not want to export to China. They are having more room. But for the user, as you mentioned about the user of these chips, they have to find out a little bit more time to adjust to the new products as the standards, as technical requirements or other issues for the software connections. So this really needs some time. But when we have no choices, I think what we can only do is trying to shorten this whole process and trying to improve the input of the resources and the collaborations of these companies, and trying to make this term shorter and shorter. And in another side, I would also argue, because China have many collaboration with trading partners, but the United States also blocked the trade with other countries by additional tariffs. So it's more likely the Chinese chips or the future products can have a better expectation from the market, like for the affordabilities and also the sustainability of the supply. I think it's definitely a real good news for Chinese companies. So in such a kind of world, we have to consider about the profits together with the risks. No companies can just survive by themselves.
But that's for, the benefits that Chinese chip suppliers can enjoy within a relatively longer term. What about in the short term then? Are we going to see any concussion from that?
Yeah, I mean that when we were trying to do that, there's still some term. I think that we are still in this process of investigation. So that means that it maybe take several months to get the result. And after that, we will also try to look at whether it is possible for us to reach some kind of consensus with the suppliers or manufacturers of the chips. If they admit these facts, and if they want to to do some kind of changes about their pricing policies or changing their strategies of the marketing, I think it's also possible for not to have additional tariffs on them. But if the decision are made, I think that definitely have some impact on the operation of these sectors. But in this regard, when the companies found that the administration is trying to do some investigation and that may affect their future supply, they will start to have more stocks, like what the companies have been doing when China and the United States we posed to end some new tariff. The companies are trying to increase their transactions process to have better and more stocks to prepare for these kind of shocks. So we don't have to worry too much about the sharp change or fluctuation of the supply. The company, they have their own strategies and preparations.
Right. Professor Powell, then the most dangerous consequence you see from these investigations with those measures on China's electronics sectors?
Look, the biggest challenge is always supply chain adjustments. So if upstream supply options become unavailable and downstream firms need to qualify new supply options, that not only takes time to do, but it also takes time to bed down. So that transitional period can be quite disruptive for enterprises, number one. The upside, and that's a medium-term issue, is that once those qualification periods are over and the transitional experiences have been gone through, then it is conceivable that a more streamlined domestic integrated supply chain environment emerges. But to get there from point A to point B, going through a significantly disruptive period, does cause enterprises to experience supply challenges, bottlenecks. It impacts production. It could impact product quality. And of course, when it impacts product quality and eventually productivity as well, it will impact the firm's standing in the wider marketplace. So disrupting mature systems is not something that enterprise managers would go out of their way to do. They would much rather continue operating in well-known, proven and tested environments and pursue improvements collaboratively rather than under the pressure of enforced changes.
Then do you see any other, manufacturers of semiconductors like those in Europe can enjoy any opportunities here?
Well, look, in these sort of areas, particularly in relatively mature product sets, there are possible supply chain options from many parts of the world, and it is conceivable that European players could find an opportunity to expand their footprint. I would think in the first instance, though, that we're really looking at domestic supply chains being able to step up. It is true, I believe, that the decision has been made on the basis of an assessment that whatever the disruptions, industry, both upstream and downstream, are now in a position to cope. It's not to say that change is smooth, but there is, I think, quiet confidence from industry and regulators that should there be need for a dramatic change in the structure of the supply, then enterprises are going to be able to handle that. The preference, as I said, is to change as little as you possibly can, but sometimes the need for change is outside of your control. It would, of course, be the ultimate of ironies if one of the results of this investigation is to create new opportunities for intensified collaboration with European supply chain partners.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Some analysts actually argue this anti-dumping investigation is far more than a simple trade remedy, but rather a landmark event in the maturity of China's semiconductor industry. I think Dr. Zhou already mentioned that aspect. So, Professor Liang, how accurate do you think this kind of statement is?
Well, I think I also mentioned earlier, I think, China always, does things in a very cautious way and always thinking about, not the next move, but maybe the next two moves. And so I think, again, the timing is right for China, not only because, to gain some sort of bargaining power at the negotiation table, but more importantly, I think China feels it's ready, right? As I mentioned earlier, that China's legacy chips production capacity has ramped up very rapidly from the global share of 17% back in 2015 to over 31% in 2023. So, and I think the benefits of having a large market like in China is that you can easily scale up your production, and therefore you'll be able to reduce the cost of production per unit. And that is a luxury I think many other markets may not enjoy. But I think if China needs to, right, fill the domestic demand needs by its domestic production capacity, I think China is able to do that. Now, of course, as you mentioned earlier, the industrial leaders, right, in the users industries will say, well, it takes some transition periods, 12 or 18 months with the supply chain disruptions and by the alternative suppliers. I think that is definitely, right, some of the obstacles on the costs to be paid. But again, I think in this case, China has no option because I think the United States has proven to be very unreliable as a trade partner, right? China does want to have the kind of interdependency with the United States or other trade partners for that matter. But I think, as far as technology is concerned, I think it's clear that countries have the interest to protect their core, technological competence. And I think the United States, getting all these behaviors, right? I think, China seems to believe these short-term adjustment costs are inevitable, and it has to develop its self-reliance. It has to be able to, seize the market. And I think, again, this is unfortunate because what we are seeing increasingly is in the tech space, we're seeing, two separate systems, right? Two parallel systems. AI is one of the examples where you could have two different standards for semiconductors. You have two different standards for AI technologies. And so, this kind of fragmentation, it's not conducive to long-term technological innovations around the world. But again, I don't think that countries these days could just sit back and relax and say, yes, we can rely on other countries to supply us, some of these leading edge, very core technologies. You hear Donald Trump talking about imposing 100% semiconductor tariffs, right? And so I think it's just, yes, we do want to maintain a normal trade relationships and have that kind of interdependency. And no, we don't like disruptions or short-term adjustment costs.
Yeah,
but again, I think,
whether these two investigations are that significant, it's called a landmark event. Dr. Zhou said it's quite rare in this sector. But with these two investigations being taken, would that mean there will be more such proactive or active action from the Chinese side toward Washington or U.S. semiconductor or tech sector in the future?
Well, I think it is possible. I think I also mentioned earlier, right, that there are different ways of coping with the kinds of non-tariff trade barriers or, the kinds of restrictions. I think this is one way, this is one of the legal tools that China can resort to. And it's definitely possible that, this could be maybe utilized more often in the future, depending on, I think, again, what, the broader, trade negotiations, the broader stance, right? I think what is the takes with China. And I think it is a possibility that, again, a lot of these, the end result could be just separate the kinds of technological ecosystem, right? Using legal tools or using other policy tools. And I think that is a possibility.
All right. And actually, those two investigations are not China's first probes into the chip sector. Last December, Beijing launched an anti-monopoly case against NVIDIA. During the recent bilateral trade talks in Madrid, Beijing also announced a preliminary antitrust finding against the company, which U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent called poor timing. So taken together, how could these moves shift the trajectory of the chip conflict or even the wider tech rivalry between the two countries? Dr. Zhou.
So I think that, this two investigations you mentioned is different from this one because those two are just having some, investigation about a certain target are very individual company or several companies. I think that one is, something to do with their maybe improper behaviors, like to do with some of these weapons, to do with Taiwan issues or other issues. I think this one is different. This one is based on the market because that economic benefits are, for the trade are important for both sides of import and export. So I think that is really a different level of investigation. That really means that the Chinese companies, Chinese sectors, and also Chinese governments are really concerned about the possible maybe the impacts of the relations of the two sides of China and United States to change. So I think that is really our phenomena. We need to be careful. I mean that is also the message I think the U.S. side has gotten from us. But I want to end another comment. I don't think that the attitudes of Chinese government has changed towards the U.S. Companies or exporters. I mean, for China side, it is very clear stated that any kind of practices to do with commercial practices are welcome. So we welcome the investment from United States. We welcome the imports from United States. But there is one condition that they are not trying to distort the market. So actually, the market principle is what we stick to. The market is the very precious things we respect. So we want to keep it going and also not trying to discriminate any foreign suppliers. But at the same time, Chinese companies are really striving very hard to find some opportunities. So we have to provide them with the same treatment like what we committed in the WTO as a national treatment, the NT. The principle is also very important.
In terms of the future of U.S.-China economic relations, let's zoom out. What do you think these probes suggest about the future? And are we, heading toward managed competition or a deeper decoupling in tech?
I mean, just from these two investigations, I think that if we put it in a bigger picture, like the TikTok results or some kind of consensus made by these two governments about the framework of the future trade agreements, I think that in my feeling, I feel that the atmosphere between these two countries are becoming normalized. Maybe in the past, we have so many, dreams or different kind of fancy about what U.S. is trying to do as a very fair country. But now we have realized that that's fact. So I think that we know that, and we have already been prepared for that. Maybe we're not ready now, but I mean, the relation between the major economies in the world will still evolving in the future. So in this regard, it's just not just unilaterally threatened from one side to another. We have some response, and that will also make that balance much better compared with before, like what we have observed with United States and other economies. It's actually different. So I would expect that the relation between these two countries to stabilize in the coming future. That is my hope. But if it cannot happen, I don't think that we will worry too much about the future. We still have more choices, and we stick to the principle, and we hope that the companies and the people of both sides can benefit from more trade and relation and the investment relations between our two countries.
All right. And to Professor Powell, your take here?
Look, it's hard to know what the short-term future holds. There's obviously some issues to be addressed at both a short-term tactical level through the current trade discussions against the backdrop of the tariff war that President Trump launched on the 2nd of April this year. But the longer-term issues, I think, will be determined less by the toing and froing of the tariff and related negotiations, but with ultimately what the shape of the world looks like in 5 and 10 years' time. And that's going to ultimately impact the way in which the United States has to come to terms with a fundamentally changed environment. For the best part of 30 years, the United States has been able to dictate terms largely unilaterally, and its capacity to do that has been anchored by both economic strength and military capability. On both of those grounds, the United States is no longer in a position to unilaterally dictate terms under all circumstances or under any circumstances to everybody, and particularly in relation to large countries and major powers like China. So the US is going to have to learn to live in a different world. And when it learns to live in a different world, I would expect that its general attitude and posture towards others will change as well. The short term, though, is going to have its up and down moments. When Scott Bessent talks about poor timing, let's not forget that in the days prior to the meeting in Madrid, we had President Trump urging the Europeans to impose 100% tariffs on China and others who would dare to buy oil from Russia. And on that basis, President Trump said he would do the same. So if the Americans wanted to take a good look at themselves in the mirror for a change, they might realize that the hypocrisy that they engage in is not only not conducive to successful short-term discussions, but ultimately undermines their own longer-term interests in an evolving multipolar world.
Hopefully they can understand that. And last but not least, to Professor Liang, how do you expect those probes to play out? And are you concerned that there would be a deeper decoupling between the States and China?
Well, first of all, I think this poor timing comment just shows the double standards. I agree with Professor Powell that not only Trump has been, hitting up the allies to impose high tariffs on China, but it also just put 23 Chinese companies, largely tech firms, on the entity list on September, 13th. But that I think it's also very poor timing, right? Because that's when you need to build goodwill and trust when it gets to the negotiations. So it's quite interesting when he said that's a poor timing for China's probes. But I think the larger issue here is, again, the United States is currently the superpower. It is the, technological leader in the world. And so seeing China's rise in the technological space, I think that sort of the sense of rivalry, the sense of competition, right, I think is what pushed the United States to take these actions, trying to, in some ways, suppress China's technological advancements. And I think that's probably going to stay for a while. And if you remember, starting from Trump's first term, or even before that, right, there's this idea of we want to somehow decouple. But I think reality has proven that decouple this idea is not going to work because the United States has been deeply integrated into the global economy, and so is China. So it's very difficult to have a wholesale decouple. But the idea is always, let's set the high fence with a small yard, or let's de-risk. So, trying to really protect the core technologies and trying to really get the upper hand in the technological competition. So I think what I'm seeing is that this is going to probably shape the future trajectory, that on the one hand, there's some normalization on the trading relationships. But on the other hand, the kind of tech competition is going to escalate, is going to continue to play out. And so whether or not this can continue this way, right? In other words, whether or not the US and China can compartmentalize the kinds of trading relationships, right? On the one hand, you can trade on all kinds of other products, but on the other hand, that you do have the kinds of barriers for technological trade. I think that it's likely to really determine how this future trajectory would look like.
And on that note, we wrap up our chat. Many thanks to Liang, Professor of Economics, Willamette University, Warwick Powell, Adjunct Professor, Queensland University of Technology, and Dr. Zhou, Deputy Director, Institute of American and Oceania Study, Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation, for your time and insights. You can find us on all major podcast platforms. Please email us your comments at radio@cgtn.com. And Tian, join us for more insights at the Chat Lounge next week. Till then, take care.
The best military commander is not he who fights 100 battles and wins every one of them. The best military strategy does not lead to the desiccation of the enemy's capital city. Decoding the Art of War will help you understand why there's no art in war and how Sun Tzu stayed undefeatable using the science of war, with fun stories and insightful breakdown of famous battles. Find Decoding the Art of War wherever you listen.